had a number of instances when I used a Ouija board. After a while, you come to understand that not every session will result in the contact with a spiritual entity. In most instances, very little is given. The one thing someone has to keep in mind is to be respectful of the spirits they are communicating with. In taunting them, you risk the invitation of evil energies. This is one such occasion when this happened to me. One of my friends had recently lost her grandmother and was interested in using a Ouija board to try and contact her. I had told her there is no guarantee that we would be able to do so, but I'd be willing to try. I instructed her to bring an item that would be of a personal importance to her loved one, and we would try using it to draw the spirit towards us. On the night we agreed to meet, my friend showed up with her new boyfriend. To put it lightly, the man was a skeptic. He didn't believe what we were doing was real and had tagged along in order to prove that his beliefs were correct. I had my reservations on allowing him to participate, but not wanting to offend my friend, I kept those to myself. In preparation for the session, I had already set up the board in my office. I directed them all to some chairs I had arranged in a circle around it and told them to sit. My friend had brought her grandmother's wedding ring to help with communication. I took it from her and placed it on the table. When I directed for all of us to place our hands on the planchette, her boyfriend let out a scoff. I knew this negative energy wasn't going to help draw someone my friend loved to us and told him to take this seriously. We moved the pointer around in a circle and I told the spirits we were opening ourselves to communication with them. I then stated we were particularly interested in talking with our grandmother. We continued to sit there waiting for something to step forward, but the planchette didn't move. The longer we waited, the larger the smirk got on the boyfriend's face. I tried 3 more times, imploring the spirits around us we were there to listen to them if they had something to say. Still, nothing. That is when the boyfriend started laughing and stating that this whole thing was a fraud, me especially so. He told his girlfriend that she was stupid for believing in such things. That is when all of us heard an audible click. Then the lights went out. At first, I thought there had been a power surge, but after looking at the switch on the wall, I could see it was in the off position. I looked over to my friend, and I could see her face was flushed. Sweat was pouring down her face, but she complained of being extremely cold. I looked at her boyfriend. He didn't seem to have anything wrong with him, but a look of terror was all over his face. Suddenly, her eyes rolled in the back of her head and she began having what looked like a seizure. I ran over to her. She continued to convulse, her body jackknifing back and forth violently. The 2 of us tried to keep her still, but she was overpowering both of us. This continued on for almost 30 seconds before she finally went still. Her eyes opened slowly, and she groaned in pain. Both of us helped her to her feet and set her back on the chair. I could still feel her burning up, and her entire body was slick with sweat. Her boyfriend was looking at me, but he didn't ask the questions I'm sure he was thinking. The truth was, I'd never seen anyone react like that while using a Ouija board before. After a few minutes, she found her voice. She asked her boyfriend to take her home. The 2 of us walked her out to their car, and I got her situated in the passenger seat. I told them both I was sorry and didn't know what had happened. I was almost positive it was the outburst by the boyfriend that had caused the whole thing, but it didn't seem the time to start pointing fingers. 20 minutes later, she called me weeping on the phone. She was telling me how sorry she was for the way her boyfriend had acted and knew it wasn't my fault and she didn't blame me. My friend said she felt like whatever had gotten inside of her had only left once they got home. I firmly believe that Ouija boards aren't inherently evil. They are simply a tool one can use. It is the manner in which you use it that causes the problem. Spirits, like people, deserve your respect. If you give that to them, they will in return. If you treat them poorly, there can be a price to pay.
7.
One year for Halloween, I had decided to attend a party with a few of my friends. We stayed late into the night and were about ready to leave when the guy whose house it was asked us if we wanted to try out a Ouija board. It was getting late, but none of us were really tired yet, and it at least gave us something to do other than drive around trying to figure out what the plan for the rest of the night would be. Craig led us down a dark hallway to a door that opened into what I could only assume was some sort of office or study. 2 walls had built-in shelves that were crammed full of books. Most of them looked recent, but some of the titles appeared older, and ones I didn't recognize. There were a few chairs stationed around the room, and in the center was a large square coffee table. A Ouija board and planchette had been placed on top of it. The board was made of wood. The markings on top of it were intricate in design and appeared hand-painted. The planchette was also made of wood with a clear glass lens that would serve as the indicator. From the patina, I assumed it was an antique and likely cost a great deal. He told us all to grab a chair so we could sit around the table. For being someone in high school, it was obvious this particular board wasn't his, and we'd probably not be doing this if his parents were here. A part of me felt guilty for being in here, but now that we were, I was looking forward to seeing what was going to happen. A small lamp that was in the corner of the room was the only source of light, but it gave us enough to see what the planchette would be pointing at. The 5 of us all placed a hand on the device and swirled it in a circle while chanting the word Ouija 5 times. My heart fluttered a bit in my chest, a mix of excitement and apprehension. "We are reaching out to any spirit that wants to contact us," Craig said. "Is there someone here?" We all sat there, waiting for a message to come through. As the seconds ticked by, all of us held our collective breath. 5, 10, 15 seconds went by, yet nothing happened. I stared at the planchette, wanting it to move, yet afraid of what it might mean if it did. "Should we ask again?" Tiffany asked. Her question was met by a couple of the others shushing her into silence. I was still looking at her when I felt the pointer begin to slide across the board. 10 eyes turned to watch what was being said. The glass disc passed over the 2 rows of letters and then the numbers to settle itself over the word yes. I knew it hadn't moved the planchette, but that didn't mean one of the others didn't. Even though I questioned what had just happened, there was a heaviness in the air that hadn't existed a moment before. Over the next few minutes, different people took turns trying to figure out who this spirit was, when and how they died, anything they could think of to try to familiarize themselves with who this entity was. The letters T-O-M-A-S were given to us for a name, which we took to be the name Thomas. Every time someone asked for personal details other than the name, we would get a random jumble of letters and numbers that didn't make any sense. The others, excited by the prospect of asking things about themselves, started peppering the spirit with questions. Even before one person had been answered, someone else would pipe in with their own. The others were starting to get testy with one another, wanting to get their questions answered. We weren't the only ones that appeared to be getting frustrated, though. The planchette started pointing to the word no after a while, no matter what question we asked. It didn't stop the others from continuing to ask the spirit things like, "Who's the guy I'll marry?" or "What is the perfect job for me?" That is, when things took a turn for the worst. Craig was in the middle of asking his latest query when I felt what seemed like a hand grasp my shoulder. It was cold enough so that a burning sensation spread through my neck and down my arm. A gasp escaped me, and then the planchette felt as though it was ripped from my hands and embedded itself into the wall 3 feet from the floor. My friend Alexandra didn't wait long before she sprung to her feet and ran out of the room screaming. The rest of us sat there and just stared. My logical mind tried to come up with some explanation to what had just happened, but nothing seemed to make sense. The planchette fell to the floor with a loud crack. The noise seemed to snap us all out of the stupor we were in. Where the pointer had hit, there was a hole about the size of a quarter in the drywall. I think we all counted ourselves lucky that none of us had been hit by it. Craig walked over and picked it up and looked it over before returning the planchette to the tabletop. I really had no interest in touching it again, but I've always been told that you have to dismiss whatever spirit you have contacted. Otherwise, you risk it staying. Even though Alex wasn't there, we quickly moved the pointer to goodbye and pulled our hands away. The experience has made me more cautious around things like Ouija boards. I've gone back to the house since then, and although I've never saw anything, I swear the heaviness still seems to linger on.
6.
It seemed whenever my friends and I got together, the conversation seemed to drift towards the supernatural. It shouldn't have been surprising since most of what we did together was watch scary movies and online videos. None of us really had any interest in doing any of these things ourselves, but the collective shudder we shared was something all of us enjoyed. One evening, my parents had brought up the subject of Ouija boards at dinner. They, being children of the 70s, told us that both of them had used one in the past with some surprising success. Both of them shared stories in which they had come in contact with something that appeared to be a spirit. I distinctly remember telling them that they were so old they couldn't use telephones to call their friends anymore, but rather a Ouija board. The joke got a chuckle from my dad and sister, but my mom just glared at me. Despite my poor attempt at humor, a seed had been planted in my mind. If there was any truth to what my parents had said, I would be willing to try using one for myself. The house we lived in was older, and I was sure there must be some spirits around from the previous owners. All I needed to do was pick up the board. The opportunity arose about a week later when I went with my mom to our local big box store. I had nearly forgotten about it when I happened by a display on one aisle that had a few board games sitting on it. Near the bottom sat a plain-looking gold and red box that had the words Ouija board printed on it. I grabbed one and asked my mom if we could get it. Initially, it seemed as if she would deny my request, but after I gave her my best please, she relented. As soon as the box hit the bottom of the cart, I had my cell phone out and had invited both of my friends over that night to try it out. They seemed just as excited as I was to finally do something that would bring us in direct contact to the ghosts and spirits we were so interested in. Just to add to the suspense of the moment, the three of us had to wait until the following evening. My mom told us that our ghost hunting adventures could wait for a night when we didn't have school the next day. Frankly, I was convinced that it was one of the greatest importances that we contacted our friends on the other side as soon as we could, but my mom is the boss. The next day seemed to drag on forever, but once the final bell rang, the three of us beelined for my house. Pizza and video games soon followed until the sun had set, and we determined it was dark enough to attempt to communicate with any spirit that would be willing to talk. Now that I'm older, I'm not sure why it would matter what time of day it was for us to begin, but I think Hollywood was convinced a lot of people that spirits are only active at night. We pulled the curtains shut and lit the 2 candles that we could find in the house. Sadly, they were vanilla-scented. Right before we began, I found myself looking at the board sitting on the floor of my bedroom. The idea that we could communicate with spirits using a board that had been mass-produced out of cardboard with a planchette made of plastic seemed a bit naive. Even so, I think all of us still held a bit of trepidation in what we were attempting to do that evening. Not wanting to be seen as chicken, I was first to place my hands on the device and looked up at my friends in a silent challenge for them to follow suit. They seemed to get the hint and settled themselves down around the board and placed their hands on the planchette as well. I started off by saying hello to any spirits who happened to be there with us and asked them if there was anyone present. Unfortunately, the pointer didn't seem interested in moving. I had only asked one question and I was already doubting the validity of the board. Undeterred, though, I asked again. This time, though, the planchette slowly slid to the word yes. I would like to tell you that I was absolutely convinced we were speaking with a spirit, but the logical part of my mind was convinced one of my friends had been behind the message. I met each of their eyes in turn. Both of them gave me a silent shake of their head, even though there was an excited grin on their faces. If I was to believe what they were telling me, we were in contact with a genuine ghost. We continued to ask questions like what the spirit's name was, when and how she or he died, if they lived in this house. Basically, everything we could think of to establish an identity to look up later. Then one of my friends did something I later learned was a bad move. He asked the spirit for a sign that they really were there. The reason this is a bad idea is, based on what some believe, it is giving the entity access to the physical plane through a door you are opening for it. After he demanded sign from the spirit, the planchette spelled the letters PC. I had a laptop in my room, but I had closed the screen once we began to cut out any glow it would give off. Fortunately, there were no knocking noises, feelings of being touched, or any other physical manifestations that would indicate that the spirit had been allowed to cross over to this plane. After that, planchette went frustratingly still. No matter what questions we asked, it refused to budge. It seemed our conversation was over. It was just as well, since we were all interested in looking up the information that the spirit had given us to see if there was any truth to what was said. As soon as I opened my laptop, the entire screen was covered in pop-up messages that ranged from advertisements to windows saying that I had a virus on my computer. All three of us sat there staring at the screen, not sure what to believe. Was it possible that a ghost had messed with my computer? I had never heard of such a thing, but there didn't seem to be any other explanation for it.
5.
A few months ago, I was spending some time with a few of my girlfriends. It had been quite a while since all of us had gotten together, and it was nice to catch up on the comings and goings of our lives. Like most adults, the daily events of our lives hadn't changed much since our marriages. Sure, we had our gripes, but what couple doesn't? As the evening progressed, we opened a few bottles of wine as we retold stories from the days when we had first met in college. It truly was just like old times. On a whim, I suggested that maybe we could try out the Ouija board that my teenage daughter had bought for a party a couple years back. I really thought it would turn into something for us all to laugh about, but in fact, it was just the opposite. Once the question was asked, all three of us got really quiet. It wasn't that I was scared to use the board itself, but rather I truly wanted to. The silence stretched on for a solid 30 seconds before Shannon said she would be willing to try it. Even though her words held some hesitancy in them, her eyes were smiling at the idea. Lori, always up for whatever, agreed as well. It took a few minutes to locate, but I did manage to uncover the board. Because the three of us were true experts on setting up a location for a seance, we cleared off the kitchen table and placed a bunch of tea candles around the room. Frankly, when we started, I thought we were more likely to get a visit from the fire department than a spirit. In expert fashion, we all placed our hands on the planchette and waited as if we expected it to start all on its own. As you must know, proper Ouija board sessions always start with a pause to read the directions that come with it. As the owner of the board, I was the one selected to ask the question once we let the spirits know we were there to listen to any messages they had. The first and most obvious question I started with was if there were any entities there with us. To my surprise, it didn't take long for the planchette to slide over to yes. I looked up to my friends, a silent question being asked of both of them with my eyes. Both of them in unison shook their heads, and they hadn't moved. Well, I didn't either, I told them. I didn't put past Lori or Shannon to play a prank like this, so I asked the spirit who they were. Your basic spirit caller ID, if you will. The pointer stayed right on top of the word yes. This told me one of two things. Either we had a bashful ghost, or the name and number was unlisted. I guess we'll come back to that question later, I said, which elicits a giggle from Lori. Moving on, I asked the spirit if it had some sort of message that it wanted to deliver. The planchette started moving quickly from letter to letter, but nothing it spelled out made any sense. I was becoming more convinced that one of my friends was moving it or the spirit was illiterate. I've about had it with this Ouija thing when I asked, "What is it you want? I don't understand what you're trying to tell us." The pointer spells out the letters Y-O-U, then stopped. Something about it didn't sit right. Even if my friends would have wanted to freak me out, which this had accomplished, it wasn't really their style. And if the spirit was in the house, it had to know it wouldn't work between the two of us. The whole dead, living thing didn't seem like a hurdle we could overcome. If it was my friends, I wasn't about to let them get the last laugh. Well, if you want me, then here I am. The shocked look on my friends' faces was enough to know that I'd won this round. Really, though, the shock was from what I had just said. The instructions on the board clearly said don't invite things into yourself or taunt the spirits when using the board. With my last statement, I'd basically done both. I sat there waiting for something profound to happen, but the seconds ticked by and nothing happened. There were no knocks, no sounds, no apparitions. Not wanting to annoy the spirits, I suggested that we stop. Both Shannon and Laurie agreed. We thanked the entity for joining us and started to move the planchette towards the word goodbye. The spirits seemed to have other ideas, though. I could feel the pointer being pushed in another direction. Curious as to what would happen next, I let it move as it willed, which happened to be the word no. All of us looked at each other, a little stunned as to what we were witnessing. At this point, I was almost positive that the three of us weren't moving the planchette. In accepting this, my declaration to the entity seemed foolish, if not outright dangerous. I needed to know what I invited in. Who is this that we're speaking to? Again, it pointed to the word no on the board. Fear and frustration fueled me repeating myself. This time I was nearly yelling the question. It only took 3 letters before I knew what it was spelling. D-E-M-O-N. Kristen, if you're doing this, it's not funny, Laurie told me. I could see real fear in her eyes now. From the look on mine, I'm sure she knew I was thinking the same thing. This had gotten beyond our control. As the one in charge of the questions, I yanked the planchette from their fingers and placed it over the word goodbye before throwing it across the room where it clattered to a halt next to the fridge. I sat there staring at it. I don't know what I expected it to do, but thankfully it just sat there on the ground until I went over and picked it up. I went back to the table and picked up the box and board and took everything out of the trash. I didn't want that thing in my house. I'd like to say that is where it ended, but that isn't the case. Since that night, I have been plagued with horrible night terrors where I can see people being torn apart. The only way I can guarantee a night full of sleep is to take a powerful sleep medication that knocks me out completely. Laurie and Shannon thankfully don't seem to have suffered the same affliction. I assume this is because I was the one who taunted the spirit. Unfortunately, I had to learn this lesson the hard way. When you invite something in, you take the chance it isn't something good.
4.
Early on in my life, I lost my mother to cancer. She had been raising me by herself, and after much deliberation, it was decided that my grandmother Ruth would be the one to raise me. The 2-generation gap could create issues at times, but there was no doubt the woman loved me as if I were her own child. She was there in the front row, cheering me on during all my sporting events, recitals, and graduations. Other than the fact she didn't give birth to me, she was still my mom. During my junior year in college, I got a phone call from my aunt telling me my grandmother was in the hospital with pneumonia. The words, "It's time to say goodbye," sent a shockwave through my heart. I couldn't believe the woman who had been there for so many of the most important events of my life was going to be gone. I flew back to Georgia 2 days later to spend the last days of her life at her bedside. We spent our time reliving the moments that were most meaningful to each other. The funny thing was, most of the most important times didn't involve the milestone events, but rather the simple things I took for granted. The dinners we had together, trips to the park, her holding me when I cried after my first boyfriend and I split up. For 2 days, we were able to share our memories with each other. On the 3rd day, she slipped into a coma and passed away. As hard as it was to see her gone, I was grateful for the time I had with her. The funeral came a few days later and was a well-attended affair. Seeing all the faces of her friends and family showed me just how many people's lives she had touched and been a part of. After everyone had left, I volunteered to help them go through her house and get things in order. There would be a number of things that had sentimental value to people, and I wanted to make sure they got them. Plus, it was a chance to spend time around that place that I had called home during my childhood. During the 2nd day, I was going through one of her closets when I came across a Ouija board. I'd never seen this type of thing before and was curious how it had gotten there. Grandma Ruth had always been a casual church-going woman, attending on most major holidays and gathering, but had never mentioned any interest in the supernatural. I had always been a big fan of the shows where groups were seeking out spirits. I'd never personally done anything myself, but seeing as I was in my grandmother's house, I figured it was possible I could contact her. I picked her bedroom as the place where there could be the strongest connection to her. I sat down on her bed with the board in my lap and concentrated on a mental picture of Grandma Ruth. I didn't see her as she'd been in the casket, but the bright and vibrant woman that lived in my childhood memories. Keeping my eyes closed, I began to speak. "Grams, I'm here in your room. I just wanted to talk if you're here with me." The planchette didn't move for a few seconds, but after a moment, it started to slide in small jerking motions. I watched it spell out letters one by one. S-U-N. F-L-O-W-E-R. It was the nickname that she had given me since I was a little girl. I started to cry. I couldn't help it. No one would know that name but her. After that, my words came out in a flood. I just kept going on and on about how I was going to miss her, and I didn't know what I was going to do without her there anymore. Just like when she was alive, she didn't say anything until I was done. It wasn't that I didn't have any more to say to her, but the sobbing had overcome my ability to do so. I sat there, my shoulders hitching up and down as I cried on her bed. From nowhere, I felt a hand rubbing circles on my back, and I could distinctly smell my grandmother's perfume in the air. I was alone in the house, but I wasn't scared. I knew who this person was, and she'd never hurt me. Finally, I was able to find my voice. "Thanks, Grams." The planchette started moving around the board again. ALWAYS. It was a shorter version of what the last thing she'd told me in the hospital before she died. A new wave of tears started to fall, but this time they were happy ones. When I told her goodbye on the board, a sense of peace had come over me. When she told me on her deathbed that she'd always watch out for me and she'd never truly be gone, I thought she meant it as a way to reduce the pain of her death. Instead, it was a promise that she kept. Whenever I find there is some problem that I can't manage to work out, I'll talk to my grandmother, and more often than not, I get some sort of inspiration. I know she's there, and I know that I'll see her again when my time comes.
3.
When it came to things that most people would consider paranormal or supernatural, I always thought I was more open-minded than most. I'd gone on a number of investigations around the country and had collected some pretty compelling evidence that would lead me to believe that there is something after this existence we all call life. In doing so, I always was told I needed to take precautions when dealing with entities that are not part of the physical realm. In my house, I'd collect various crystals and symbols of power that were supposed to shield me from negative entities and the like. This practice came about after a particularly frightening experience I had while using a Ouija board. This is that story. I was just out of college when me and my girlfriend at the time were walking through an antique store when she happened to spot something on a shelf. At first, I thought it was a strangely decorated box. But when she opened it up and I saw a planchette sitting inside a velvet-lined impression, I clearly saw for what it was, an old Ouija board. Even at the age I had more than a passing interest in the paranormal, and I begged her to let me buy it, thinking she'd want it for herself. I stuck out my lip in an exaggerated pout and batted my lashes while letting out what I hoped was a pathetic, "Please." I used this tactic before to much success, and this time was no different. She relented, and I was the one who ended up with the antique. That evening, I went about cleaning the dust off and polishing the wood. My initial intention was that this would be a decoration rather than something I'd actually use. Because of its age and condition, which was very good, I didn't want to risk it being damaged. Still, it seemed a shame to just set it aside without using it at least once. They say it isn't always a good idea to use a board by yourself, But I was the only one home at the time, and even if it hadn't been the case, no one I lived with was likely to want to join me either, for fear or disbelief. So I sat down on the floor in my study and stated that I was there to receive any messages that the spirits would like to communicate to me. Only seconds had passed before the planchette started to move slowly across the board. It spelled the word Hello, after which I returned the greeting. I asked if the spirit would tell me its name, but it quickly went to the word no. This wasn't the first time I had dealt with a spirit that didn't want to tell me its name, but there had been times in the past when a negative energy had come through with the same occurring. I continued to ask questions to which the entity seemed to be giving very vague answers. When I confronted it on this very fact, the spirit seemed to get extremely upset. It began using offensive language, and the planchette would move in quick jerking motions. At this point, I was sure that I was dealing with some sort of malevolent spirit or demonic entity. I knew from my readings into these beings that their name is something that holds power over them, so I asked again what its name was. Again, I received an answer of no. The pointer began moving in large, angry circles over the board at such a high rate that I had to focus to keep my hands in contact with it. I knew that I needed to end the session. I went to move the planchette to goodbye, but in doing so, I felt 3 streaks of pain lance down my back. I yelped in pain and momentarily forgot about the Ouija board on my lap. My back felt like it was on fire, but I was finally able to move the pointer to where it hovered over goodbye. As I did so, the pain seemed to reduce immensely, although it didn't disappear altogether. All thought and care for the Ouija board gone, I threw it off me and ran to the bathroom. Even before I lifted my shirt, I saw 3 red lines running up my shirt where I had bled into the fabric. When I lifted my shirt, the sight was even worse. Not only was I bleeding, but the scratches were an angry red. Small blisters were beginning to form along the jagged lines. It was obvious that the negative spirit had attacked me when I tried to learn its identity. I knew I had opened up myself to the attack by not shielding myself from the negative spirit when I began. In most cases, I would have said some sort of prayer so only benevolent spirits would come through, but in my haste to try out my new purchase, I hadn't done so. Like any tool, the Ouija board is not good nor evil. I made the mistake of not doing what I had to do so I would be protected. I still possess the board, and it sits in a prominent location in my house. Now it serves as a decoration, though, rather than a medium to contact the spiritual realm. I don't expect that to change anytime soon.
2.
I had an opportunity a little while ago to take part in a group investigation of an old sanitarium. Me and about 20 other amateur ghost hunters signed up to take part in the experience in hopes of catching some video footage, EVPs, or other evidence proving the existence of the supernatural. I didn't have much as far as equipment as concerned, but at the time, I had a decent recorder and I decided to take a Ouija board with me. I figured using them in tandem would give me a chance to compare the audio I captured with the message I received on the board. I should have known I was in over my head when I got the first look at the building. Dirt and grime covered the entirety of the 2-story building from decades of neglect. The plants that had survived had taken over what once was the entirety of the grounds. Nature was in the process of taking back what was once hers. The bus stopped outside the front gate where 2 people stood with bright smiles on their faces. I suppose they could have really loved their jobs, but someone who looked forward to a place such as this has something wrong with them. All of us disembarked from the shuttle and we were gathered together for a brief safety briefing concerning the sanitarium. We were told the right-hand side of the upper floor was off limits because they couldn't guarantee that the floor would hold our weight. They also paired us off with a partner in case something happens to somebody while we were there. We all told them we understood what was expected, and then, those like me who came alone were paired with other ghost hunters. My partner was a woman in her late 40s named Diane. To my chagrin, she informed me that this was her first time doing something like this, but she'd watched a lot of television where people had done so she was sure she could handle it. Frankly, I had my doubts. Every group was given a pair of flashlights along with a map of the layout of the place, which was labeled with the areas where most of the reported activity had been witnessed. I quickly scanned the piece of paper and made a mental note to check out the morgue and the lockdown units. I was here to communicate with a spirit, and I figured that there wasn't any more place like this for it to happen than these locations. I just hoped Diane was up for the challenge. If not, though, I'd go by myself. We made our way across the 50 yards to the front door, and we made our way into the entry room of the building. Other than the dirt and debris on the floor, it looked like any other hospital. Back when this place was open, I can only imagine the contrast between this room and what lay beyond for those who called this place home. Diane had kept the map for us, and I asked her where she wanted to start. To my surprise, she told me that the morgue was the first place she thought we should go. I agreed with her, and we took off toward the stairwell that led down to that part of the building. I would have thought we wouldn't be the ones to go, but it seemed the others were willing to ease their way into the evening rather than jumping right into it. On our way down, we had a chance to make a bit of a game plan. She had brought a handheld video camera and an audio recorder similar to mine. I suggested that we use the Ouija board and set up the video camera and recorders to see if we could capture anything. She agreed, but I could tell she was a little scared at the prospect of what might happen. It is one thing to say you're going to go to a place like this, it's another to stare that fear in the face. The basement smelled like I thought it would, stale air and mildew. The beams of the flashlights illuminated the peeling white paint on concrete walls, a single hallway to the left and right. According to the map, the morgue was at the end of the hall on the left. The ceiling was low, and it felt like it was pressing down on top of me. I had the urge to duck down to keep from hitting my head, even though there was at least a foot of clearance. Our footsteps echoed loudly in both directions, making it seem as if we were being followed by someone just outside our cocoon of light. I knew this was going to be a bit unnerving down here, but what I was feeling far exceeded my expectations. On our way down the hall, small doorways were inset into the walls. Not all of them had doors which led us quickly to inspect them. From what we guessed, they might have been alcoves for storage in years past, but now they laid empty. At the end of the hall, an opening came into view. The metal door had been left ajar, leaving a patch of darkness. To my surprise, the door opened soundlessly when I pushed it open. The room had 3 concrete islands about waist high in the center with large holes in the floor that at one time served as drains. I tasted bile in the back of my throat as I thought about what vile substances had been washed down those holes. Diane began by setting up her camera in one corner of the room where it would be able to capture as wide an angle as possible. I put the Ouija board and recorders on the center slab and positioned one of the flashlights so we would be able to see what letters the planchette pointed to. We moved the planchette in a circle and stated that we were willing to listen to any messages the spirits had. After we completed the opening, it felt like the temperature in the room dropped almost instantly. I had heard of cold spots before, but experiencing one firsthand was unsettling. The flashlight appeared to flicker, and the planchette began to glide slowly across the board. The letters came slowly at first, but by the 4th or 5th letter, the spirit seemed to be getting a handle of the device. WHOYOU. It spelled, to which Diane and I introduced ourselves. We asked the spirit their name, and the letters came SCRED. Were given, which we took to mean the spirit was afraid to tell us. We continued to ask the questions of the spirit, but the answers we got either didn't make sense or the planchette didn't move. I was starting to think this wasn't going anywhere when something hit the door behind us. The loud metallic bang had caused both Diane and I to jump. We returned our hands to the planchette and asked the spirit if that was him or her that had made that noise. The pointer quickly moved to the word no. Then who did it? I asked. The planchette gave us 4 letters, THEM. Every hair on my body felt like it was standing on end. I looked around, but the flashlight did little to dispel the shadows in the room. I had seen enough of this room for me to know that we needed to leave. From the look on her face, it appeared Diane agreed with me. The two of us moved the planchette over to the word goodbye, and I said that we were closing the session and we were leaving the spirits here in peace. The two of us quickly packed our gear and walked quickly out of the morgue, down the hall, and up the stairs to the first floor of the building. The entire time we were leaving, it felt to me like something was either following us or watching us leave. The echo of our footsteps did little to assure me that this wasn't the case. Finally, back on what I considered safe ground, Diane and I were anxious to see what the camera and recorders had caught. We started by replaying my audio recording. You could clearly hear my voice as I went about asking questions. It wasn't until I got to the part when I asked who made the banging noise, a light whisper could be heard saying, "Bad men." I know Diane had heard it too, because we both looked right at each other. I never expected to capture such a clear EVP. When we listened to Diane's recorder, the voice could not be heard. I think both of us were a little disappointed at this because it would have meant corroborating evidence that hadn't been an anomaly. The real exciting thing, though, was when we reviewed the footage caught on the video camera. She had set it to low light mode, which gave us a better view. The camera had been pointing towards the doorway, and when the banging happened, I barely even registered it. My mouth was already hanging open from what I had seen. Right next to the door, there appeared to be two humanoid-shaped figures. We both conferred with each other about the positioning of the lights and the possibility that it was us creating the shadows, but based on the angles, it was impossible for us to be casting them. Was this the bad men our spirit had talked about, or was this the spirit that was speaking with us? That night in the morgue was an exciting and terrifying experience. It gave me a first-hand look into the supernatural realm and a better respect for it. Places like that sanitarium are the types of location where spirits continue on, forgotten, a continuation of the lives they lived. A few years ago, I went to a psychic medium in hopes of contacting my dad's spirit. He had died when I was young, and I was seeking out his approval for the choices I'd made in my life, especially those as a parent. He'd done so much for us, and I tried to walk in his footsteps, if not fill his shoes. Even though I was told that there were no guarantees that he would make himself known, I had high hopes that he would come forward. We'd always shared a strong connection while he was alive, and I was sure he'd answer my call, even after all the time that had passed. The woman had, in fact, been able to give me some messages, but when the time for the session ended, I found myself wanting to ask more questions. Now that I had established his willingness to make contact, I felt comfortable trying to seek out answers on my own. I don't possess any psychic abilities of my own, so I was relegated to using a Ouija board in hopes of communicating with my departed father. Even though I was a firm believer in the spiritual realm, I had my hopes as to the power of a mass-produced item such as the one I was going to use. I reached out and asked my mother and sister to aid in my goals. I figured that soliciting people that were close to him would only help draw him to us. Both of them were also believers in the supernatural and had been the ones who suggested I seek the help of the medium in the first place. So when I asked for the help, they were quick to agree. We agreed to meet at my mom's house. Again, a choice based on it was the same place where I grew up and the last place Dad called home. After a quick discussion, we chose Saturday night as the time in which all of us would attempt to contact him. After we hung up, it was like time decided to move at half speed. Work seemed to drag on, and the television shows that I normally found escape through seemed to not be able to hold my interest. The possibility of talking to my dad again seemed to have taken up residence in my mind, and nothing could distract me for more than a moment or two. Despite its best attempt, the week did finally come to an end, and the three of us were sitting around my mom's dining room table. We turned off all the lights in the room and lit a few candles that we had gathered from various parts of the house. The board sat out on the table, waiting for us to begin. I had to admit, even if we weren't able to make contact with my dad, the room definitely looked the part for what we planned on doing that night. Unbidden, a tremor passed through me. We were here with the best of intentions, but I had to admit, the atmosphere was more than a little creepy. Before we began, my mom placed the ring she gave him when they were married on the board. This had been planned in order to help draw him to us. Afterwards, all of us placed our hands on top of the planchette and stated to the spirits of the house that we were closing this gathering to any spirits who meant us any harm. Next, we moved the pointer in a circular pattern and said that we were reaching out to the spirit of my dad. I sat there with my fingers lightly on the planchette while my eyes bore holes through the board in front of me. My eyes started to burn as I refused to blink, fearing that I might miss the slightest hint that he was here with us. Seconds continued to tick by, but nothing happened. I felt my hope beginning to wane. I distinctly remember thinking, this is what I got for believing this piece of cardboard and plastic would let me talk to my dad. I started to feel a tightening in my chest, and my heart began to beat noticeably faster. When the planchette first moved, it was so slight, I almost thought I imagined it. Then it moved again, and I had to hold back a gasp. Hope bloomed in me for an instant, then threatened to extinguish just as fast when I looked at the two other women with me. They were so focused on what was happening that I didn't think there was any way they could have done it themselves. The pointer moved smoothly over the board as it selected 6 letters: F-A-M-I-L-Y. When it concluded the final letter, I felt a tear run down my cheek. Too overcome with emotion, my sister asked the only question that mattered at the point. "Dad, is that you?" The planchette didn't hesitate for a moment before it made its way over to yes. I asked him if he was okay, and the device made a circle back to the word yes. For the next hour, it was like we were having a conversation, although it was in an unconventional manner. Dad continued to assure us that he was always with us, especially in the most important parts of our lives. He even thanked my sister for naming her 4-month-old son after him. This revelation brought about quiet sobs from her, which required a stoppage until she could regain her composure. The emotions of the experience were taking their toll on all of us. I could have sat there at the table for hours, but my body was already begging for sleep. Mom especially looked like she was about to fall asleep where she sat. I told my dad that we were going to go, but wanted him to know that we missed him dearly and loved him very much. That is when the most amazing part of the evening happened. "I love you." It was only a whisper, but I still knew the sound of my dad's voice. My eyes shot open, and for a moment, all of the fatigue I had been feeling suddenly vanished. The voice had been so quiet, and I almost didn't believe that it had actually happened. I looked up and saw startled expressions on my mom and sister's faces. I wanted to tell them what had happened, but I couldn't bring myself to speak, but doing so felt like a betrayal. This was a message just for me and me alone. I like to believe that all of us received a similar message that night. It was a moment of healing and closure for all of us. Dad was taken from all of us far too soon, and it was his way of telling us that he is proud and loves all of us. Since that night, we've tried to contact his spirit, but the planchette has remained still. If the whisper he spoke in my ear is the last thing I hear from my dad, I can't think of anything that I would have wanted to hear more.